Okay, we are recording. Okay, and I'll say again, if there's something that I guess if you have a question that you want to ask, but you don't want to be recorded, you can ask me later. Okay, or send me an email. But this will eventually be on the Synagogue's YouTube channel. You can follow up there. And okay, so in the chat, I just put a link to. Waiting for Mina to okay. In the chat, I just put a link to the document that we're going to use to sort of orient our discussions. It's a small enough group that you should be able to ask, just unmute yourself to ask any questions. And if it's easier, use the chat to ask questions. And I will be listening for your unmuted questions, and I will be also monitoring the chat. Okay, so thank you. Okay, so first topic, okay, history of the Torah and Halakhah. I want to talk about what is Judaism? How do Jews live our lives? How do we serve God? What's the nature of our covenant, this pact we made with God? And so we're going to talk about how to be, like Halakhah is the word I'm going to use for how to be Jewish, like to follow the laws of Judaism and the rituals of Judaism. And the Torah is the thing that God gave us, the set of wisdom that God gave us, the instructions God gave us in order to be Jewish and to faithfully live up to this covenant. So the first item I have here is Pre-Sinai, okay? Because the Hebrew Bible, the book of Genesis and the book of Exodus talk about God creating the world and creating humanity, and God having a relationship with every human being, and God being disappointed by humanity and destroying humanity with a flood, and then dispersing humanity with the Tower of Babel. And then after that, the Torah switches its focus, and the Torah stops being a book about God's relationship to the world and starts focusing in on God's relationship with one family. And not because God doesn't care about everyone, but because the focus of the book shifts. And it seems that God is trying to influence humanity by really investing in one family that somehow got it right, and using that family to, through them, influence the world. And that family is the family of Abraham and Sarah. And the book of Genesis describes that family and their values and their struggles and their trials and tribulations, culminating in the end of the book of Genesis with that family going down to Egypt. And the book of Exodus talks about that family being enslaved in Egypt and then being freed from slavery in Egypt, God taking the people out of Egypt to be a special people in fulfillment of the promise made to the patriarchs and the matriarchs. And then the Torah is given. So what's the nature of all of the religious practices and ideals that existed before the Torah was given? It's sort of it's not so simple. It's not so simple. And a lot of, if the moment when we stood at Mount Sinai and were given the Torah is this pivotal moment where we became a people with a covenant, a special pact with God, then everything that came before is like a preface to that moment. But it's really important. It's really a really important preface, right? It gives us part of the melody, the poetry to go along with the prose. Maybe I'm struggling for metaphors here, right? But I think the experiences of first of all the patriarchs, and they were shepherds and they had neighbors who weren't always so nice to them. It was hard to get along with. All those struggles, I think also gets into your DNA as a people, and you have that kind of inherited trauma, inherited memories, and certainly the experience of being a slave in Egypt was meant to be permanently imprinted on our Jewish DNA. And so when the Torah was given to us, it was given to us. God introduces God to us, say, "I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt." Right? That's that. It's our story together, our history together as a people, being redeemed from Egypt, rescued from Egypt, is that preface for God giving us a Torah. But the actual content of what we do, right, from a legal perspective, which really only goes back to Sinai, right? The fact that that the practices of the patriarchs are not legally binding. Okay, what's legally binding is the content of what was in the Torah. Is that the distinction that makes sense? So the nods are helpful. Thank you. Okay. All right. Great. Questions or comments on this? Okay. I realize looking at this syllabus curriculum, that doesn't. I don't include like an overview of the basic storyline of the Torah. The plot of the Torah is not here. So that's, I don't know, it's something you should, it's important to like, you should read the Torah, okay? Like the 5 books of Moses certainly like is something yeah, it's something that you should read. In some way, you could read it with the synagogue cycle, right? 1 parsha per week, right? And that's a good way to do it, or to start at the beginning at a time of your convenience and read. But the basic storyline is important to know, and then it's not really covered in this class. So, okay, let's see what letter B says. Letter B is the Sinai. Okay, Sinai. So this is a really important moment. Okay, maybe I'll, I was discussing this with a yeah. So Sinai is when the Torah was revealed. Okay, and Orthodox Jews believe that the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, is the direct product of divine intervention, and that the Torah was given along with the written Torah was given along with the oral Torah. Okay, so let's just first define these terms. This is important. The written Torah, okay, it should be sounds kind of intuitive, but the written Torah, but it's like what we have on the Torah scroll. Okay, have you all seen a Torah scroll? Yeah, has anyone not seen a Torah scroll up close? No one's admitting it. Okay. What are some details of a Torah scroll? What? So wait, would you raise your hand? Or was that a hand or? Okay, I thought no. Okay. What are some details of a Torah scroll that are like make it different from some other books you may be familiar with? You can please feel free to unmute yourself, and okay, it can be no wrong answers, I promise. Okay.
It's handwritten.
It's handwritten. Beautiful. Right. It's handwritten. That's different. Good. What else? I'll say another one. Okay, I'll say some other physical properties. It's written on parchment, not paper. And most books we have now are paper. It's also not really a book. A book is technically pages that are bound. And I think actually a book technically has to be made with a printing press as opposed to handwritten. I think a handwritten book is called a codex. Okay, but it's neither a codex nor a book because it's a scroll, right? So it's one long thing. It's okay. What else? What's on the parchment in ink on parchment written by hand? What's there and what's not there? That's not your question, I promise. You don't trust me? Yes. You think, Cassie?
I don't know. Something I always think about how it's just the text. There's no like nifty headings and footnotes and like chapters versus it's just the text.
Precisely. It's just the text. I'm going to be even more. It's also without that. It's what? Sorry. What did you say?
Be more specific.
Be more specific. I should be more specific. I will be more specific. It's just the text without vowels and without punctuation. Okay. The Torah scroll is just letters. Okay. Black letters on white parchment. That's it. So you have the letters and you have the spaces between them. So you have paragraphs, and because there are spaces, and you have words because spaces between letters make words, and spaces between groups of words make paragraphs. What you don't have are periods, commas, quotation marks, and you don't have vowels. Okay, Hebrew is written without vowels. There are no vowels. There are no vowels. The Hebrew letters, the Hebrew alphabet has no vowels, and so even the basic, like, how do I read this, right? What does it sound like when I read this is not actually contained in the text itself. You need an oral tradition, okay? You need someone to teach you what it's supposed to sound like when these words are read, and that too is part of the oral Torah. Many, 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 many years later, around the year 1000, so it was both a long time ago, but it was a very long time after Sinai, okay? After the Torah was given, after the entire biblical period, after the Talmud was written, okay? And around the year 1000, that's when, for the first time, somebody, not a group of people, decided, oh, wouldn't it be helpful if we invented vowels for Hebrew? Okay, and if you learn how to read Hebrew, though, the vowels, little marks, those little the kamatz and the patach and the chirik, the dot and the thing with the right, all those marks. Those are not letters, right? Those are vowels, and they were invented about 1,000 years ago in Tiberias. And the people who invented those vowels, they also then went and said, oh, let's also figure out a way to notate what it sounds like, the melody of the chanting of the Torah, and they put in, the ends of each of the verses, and the other we call cancellation marks, which indicate how it sounds when the Torah is chanted. So that also is oral Torah. They had a tradition; they didn't make that up. They made up the way to write it down, but they didn't make up what it sounds like. So we have at least, right, just in terms of the oral Torah, at least it's what it sounds like when these words are read, which can very much change the meaning, obviously, depending on, because sometimes you can have the same letters which could be pronounced in very different ways with very different meanings based on the vowels, which are not indicated in the written Torah itself. So the oral Torah is what it sounds like when the written Torah is read, and therefore the basic meaning of what the words are saying. But the oral Torah is more than that, and I'd say there are different perspectives and theories about exactly how much more it is. I'd say at a minimum, the oral Torah could have been God saying to Moses, take this written Torah, and also I want you to interpret the written Torah and derive additional meaning from the written Torah. And this is really important for all of the legal portions, the mitzvot of the Torah, the commandments, okay? Because the Torah has very little details about almost any of the things it tells us to do. It says observe Shabbat. It doesn't really tell us what that entails. It tells us some things are a little obscure. Start counting the days until the holiday of Shavuot, from the Macharat HaShabbat, the day after the Sabbath day. What exactly does the day after the Sabbath day mean? Does that mean on a Sunday day, or does that mean, no, in that context, maybe the Sabbath day means Pesach, the holiday of Pesach, which is what we actually do, right? So just very, very basic information about how to be Jewish, how to observe the mitzvot, how to follow the commands of the Torah. It really requires us to make recourse to the oral Torah. So at a minimum, we were empowered to interpret and derive and read the verses very carefully so that more meaning emerges from it at a minimum. And maybe at a maximum, the oral Torah was actually really comprehensive and actually included the details. That's like two ends of a spectrum. Like all Orthodox Jews believe in the oral Torah. And even before, all traditional Jews believe in the oral Torah. So some would say the oral Torah is God gave us the Torah and said, now go and interpret it. And it was just that empowerment, started off this chain of scholarship and interpretation, and ultimately the normative, meaning everyone agrees this is what these words mean. That's on one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is no, actually the revelation was really, really comprehensive. And, God told Moses, in the Torah, it says, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. It says that 3 times. That means don't cook any dairy or meat products together, and don't eat dairy meat products that were cooked together. Don't derive benefit from dairy meat products that have been cooked together. Okay, that is what that is what rabbinic tradition tells us those verses mean. It says 3 times, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. That's what rabbinic tradition teaches us that those words mean. So it could be that God explicitly told Moses, this is what these verses mean. Or it could be God told Moses, here's the Torah. I really want you to figure out how to live by this and interpret it and discover the meaning. And then it may have been centuries later that sages first, chachamim, rabbis, read those verses and figured out what those words meant. But we don't just read the written Torah alone, right? There is a religion that believes you open the Bible and you figure out what it tells you, and that's and that religion is Protestant Christianity. Okay, Jews believe in the Torah means what the rabbis, what the rabbinic tradition tells us it means. Okay, certainly when it comes to what we do, when it comes to deriving meaning and interpret, everyone's entitled and empowered, should we feel entitled and empowered to like have at it, okay? Figure out what it means and argue about it and discover something new. And that's great, but we also have to like live together, right? And so, for example, the Torah says there's a holiday called Shavuot, and that holiday comes 50 days after we count 50 days, and then the holiday of Shavuot occurs. So when do we count the 50 days? The Torah says, Mimacharat HaShabbat, the day after Shabbat. So does that mean you start counting the 50 days on the first Sunday after Passover? Or does that mean you start counting the 50 days after the first day of Passover? And in this context, the word Shabbat is actually referring to Passover, which is also a day when we don't do any work. So, if we're just like debating what the words mean, like, let 1,000 flowers bloom, who cares? Like, we can argue about it forever, and that's wonderful. But if we're all going to celebrate the holidays together, we need a mechanism for like deriving it, coming to consensus. And so the oral Torah, so when it comes to like the legally binding meaning of like the mitzvot that are contained in the Torah, there's like not so, there is like a right answer, okay? And that right answer is we know that right answer from the oral Torah. When it comes to, the stories in the Torah and there's some symbolism, what they mean, and even just the plain sense meaning of the biblical text and what it might signify. Okay, when it comes to that, there's no, we can debate and discuss forever. But we're still not Protestants because we still don't believe in like just opening the Bible and letting it like talk to us, because we want to, even if we're going to like come up with something new, the story of, Abraham traveling to Egypt. Okay, there's a, story that, what does it mean? Like, what does it teach us? Okay, so yeah, it's not like telling us what to do. So there's no, if you and I could have, all of us on this call could have a different, all 11 of us could have a different interpretation of the significance of that story. And that's great. But the Jewish way to go about that is to see what others have said before, right? Like we inherit a tradition that goes back, again, thousands of years about what this might mean, what the words might mean, what the symbolism might, what the significance of that story might mean. And so when we come to add our own voices, we're really taking part in that conversation that's existed before us. Okay, was it right? When Abraham went out to Egypt at a time of famine, was that good or was that bad? And either one, and what was the significance of it for later Jewish history? Okay, Ramban, Nachmanides in the 13th century has something to say about that, and Rashi in the 11th century has something to say about that, right? So that's great, but like, let's learn what they said, and we can say who's right, who's wrong, and we can say, I here's something fresh that I believe. Beyond that, but we're taking part in a conversation that came before us. The first book printed in Hebrew was the Torah with the Commentary of Rashi. Rashi, a medieval scholar, wrote a commentary on the entire Torah. So when the printing press was invented, Jews really loved the printing press. We printed a lot of books. And the first book printed in Hebrew was a Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, with Rashi's commentary. No Jewish publisher printed a version of the Torah without Rashi's commentary from the very first book printed in Hebrew until the 1950s. Okay, I have a copy somewhere. The Koran Tanakh was published in 1950. It was this modern, font and new Israeli edition of the Hebrew Bible, and it was the very first time a Jewish publisher had ever printed a Hebrew scripture without Rashi's commentary. Okay, so there's a reason for that, and it's good, it's bad, whatever. But we offer our own opinions, and we believe in creativity, but we also want to join the conversation that existed before us. Okay, I've spoken for a really long time. Questions, comments, reactions? Please unmute yourself if you love to hear from more of you, so I can rest my voice and hear some other ideas that aren't mine. Okay, that's fine. Okay. C, Midrash Halakhah, Midrash Agadah. Okay. So this process that I described of interpreting verses is called Midrash. Okay, Midrash means explication, interpretation. And there are 2 varieties of Midrash that have existed in rabbinic literature, okay, that comprise like a core component of the oral Torah. There's Midrash Agadah, Midrash Halakhah. So Midrash Agadah is Midrashim about Agadah, which let's say means stories. Okay, so you have the narrative parts of the Torah, you have the stories in the Torah, and so midrashim that unpack those stories. Okay, why did Abraham go down to Egypt? Okay, what's the what was Moses' childhood like? Okay, you look for gaps in the Torah, in the written text, and you fill in those gaps. I mean, Moses' childhood, like the Torah skips Moses' childhood, which is like kind of a big deal. He's an important character. How does he just wake up one day and decide that he's Jewish? Okay, like what's going on there? Okay, like it's a lot that's missing in the story. Okay, God speaks to Abraham and says, "Go and to the land of Canaan, and I'm going to make you a blessing." Who was Abraham? Like, why did God pick Abraham? That's like a really big deal, right? That's missing from the Torah. Why did God pick Abraham? What made Abraham so special? He deserved that. So Midrash Agadah fills in the gaps in the stories. It's close reading because it's like it's clued into picking up on, again, gaps in the text or peculiarities in the text, a word you don't expect, a phrasing that seems a little bit odd, or that you can ask a question about. So it's picking up on things that are there, and then it expands it into elaboration and another story. So, for example, why did anyone know any of the midrashim about why God chose Abraham? Is there any of these stories? Have you counted them? So there are midrashim that Abraham, as a young man, realized that the idols, his father owned an idol shop, and he sold idols, and Abraham realized this was, baloney, and he smashed his father's idols and blamed it on the biggest idol, and said, "Oh, he was jealous of, they got into a fight, and he destroyed them. And his father's, that's ridiculous. These idols can't do anything." And he said, "See, Dad, you self-admitted that these idols can't do anything. So why are you worshiping them, right?" And he was reported to the king that he's this religious subversive, and the king threw him into a furnace, and he survived the fiery furnace. And this is all the backstory to Abram being chosen by God. Oh, and then his brother got thrown into a furnace and he didn't survive. And that's also, these are all hints. If once you know these are like allusions to these stories in the Torah, but it's not there. None of that's there, but it's answering a fundamental question: why did God choose Abraham? Okay, Jordan, I saw you were nodding. Like maybe you've heard some of these before, or yeah. Okay. When it comes to Midrash Agadah, you don't have to believe that they're right, okay? Like some rabbi got up and said, "Here's my interpretation," and he could be right or he could be wrong. The stakes aren't so high. If I think that, like some Midrashim say that Abraham was 3 years old, was a child when he discovered that one God, and he was a child when he broke his father's idols. Others say, no, he was 40 years old. He was 40 years old when he started to question matters of religion, and he didn't actually discover God until he was an old man. So that's a different interpretation, right? That's okay. It's okay to have different interpretations of the stories and what they mean, because it's not like when do we celebrate Shavuot, okay? Or how do we keep a kosher kitchen, right? It's okay if we each have different interpretations. Midrash Halakhah is that same process of Midrash, the same process of interpretation, but deployed not on the stories of the Torah, but deployed on the legal sections of the Torah, okay? Again, filling in those details that are absent from the Torah itself, and filling in enough details so that we can actually live our lives based on these mitzvot. So when do we celebrate Shavuot? What does Mimachrat HaShabbat mean? Okay, count 50 days, Mimachrat HaShabbat. What does Lo Tivashel Gedi B'Chelev Emo mean? What does it mean? Don't boil a kid in its mother's milk, repeated 3 times in the Torah. What's that telling us? Okay, how do we observe Shabbat? The Torah says don't work on Shabbat. What is it? What's the definition of work? Okay, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Every mitzvah in the Torah requires some added explication, some added detailing, and et cetera. And so that's called Midrash Agadah. Midrash Agadah, it's more important that we all agree. And so there are sometimes contradictory opinions in Midrash Halakhah, but the rabbinic task is to figure out the correct meaning of those verses so that we can all live together and have the same mitzvah. And more or less that occurred, okay? Thousands of years ago, the rabbis were successful in doing that. Okay, questions, comments? Okay.
I'm curious.
Yeah.
You talked about the spectrum of beliefs on revelation, whether it was initiated the process of figuring out the Torah, or whether I'm wondering where you land on the spectrum.
That's a great question. I think I'm more on the oral Torah. I mean, I think some information, some content was included in the revelation of the oral Torah. Not just this is where you put the periods, but like maybe a little bit more than that. But I think a lot of the oral Torah was like an empowerment and encouragement to derive. And I think that because when you read Midrash Halakhah, it seems like they're discovering the meaning of those verses that they're interpreting rather than just like if the revelation is comprehensive, then what were those midrashim? What were they doing? So some would say, yeah, those midrashim were not generative, were not creative. They were just connecting laws they knew to the verse. It was like a mnemonic activity. I have all these laws and I have the written Torah. Let me, make ties between the laws that I have and the written Torah. And that's the process of Midrash. It doesn't seem that way. It seems Midrash is really much more creative, that like, what does this mean? And we're trying to figure out what it means. And, if this verse means this, then it can't also mean that. So I need something to hang this on. So maybe that's what this verse means. And it seems much more like actually, like the stakes seem kind of high frequently enough when you read the Midrashim or the Talmud, which includes some Midrashim, right? The stakes seem high. So that to me just feels that like this is like a generative process. There's a wonderful, wonderful book called How Do We Know This, which I think is now back in print after not being in print for a long time. Strongly right. It's not an easy read, but I not terribly. Yeah, you're gonna show us if you have a picture, a copy of that. You're gonna show us a little. Hey, now show us. Where's your bookmark? How far have you gotten?
It's actually my second read through. I think I'm on page.
Second read through.
Yeah,
okay.
it's I wouldn't call it light reading necessarily, but it is good reading. Yeah.
Okay. That's great. I'm really happy that you read. Okay. That book was really, really helpful. So it's a history of this question, a history of how Jews have thought about the relationship between the written Torah and the oral Torah. Okay. And including in the modern period of time where it becomes like this major, where like people really like theorize and, the last 200 years, there's a lot of like writing and focus on this question. Okay. Cassie, you raising your hand, or was that?
Oh yeah, I was raising my hand. Just briefly, could you share how the CRC feels about the relationship between those?
I think all the CRC. If you are going to be asked this question for the CRC, you need to know that the oral Torah gives the explanations of the written Torah. It'd be helpful to have some examples of things we only know about from the oral Torah. I gave you two examples about don't boil the kid's mother's milk and the date of Shavuot. Those are great examples of things that like the oral without the oral Torah, we really wouldn't know what to do. There are hundreds of others. Eye for an eye means monetary compensation. That's also the oral Torah teaches something that we wouldn't necessarily intuit from the written Torah, and that they need to know the oral Torah comes from God. They don't need to know precisely. They're not going to ask any more of the nuances beyond that. I think so. I think because they understand. I think that there's a wide range of ways that very, very Orthodox Jews have thought about this for the last 3,000 years, and so they know that too. Okay. All right, next. Let's see if we go a little bit farther. D, maybe this will be our last topic, writing down the oral tradition. So the oral tradition, okay, is called the oral tradition because it was not ever written down. It was just oral. It was passed on from teacher to student orally, okay, like words, okay, that were memorized and transmitted. And that seems to have been part of the right, that, like it emerges from a student-teacher relationship, right? Discourse between human beings in the context of a relationship. There's a teacher, there's a student. The student then becomes a teacher to the next generation, and that's what's passed on for centuries in that living context of human beings interacting with one another, in community with each other, in relationship with each other. That's how the oral Torah was meant to be transmitted and preserved and expanded and developed. At some point, the feeling was that this was not sustainable, and that the oral Torah was at risk of being lost and forgotten if it were not consigned to writing. So we don't know exactly when this happened. Actually, it's sort of like this big issue, moment in Jewish history. We don't exactly know when it happened. We do know that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi in around the year 200, supervised the editing of the Mishnah, which is sort of a codification, distillation of the Oral Torah. We know that Tosefta, which is also a collection of the Oral Torah, was edited more or less around that same time. I think scholars now think that it was edited as an oral book. So it was also memorized. It wasn't actually written down until much, much later. We know, though, that by the end of the rabbinic period, all of the books, all the surviving books or collections of the Oral Torah, all of the surviving components of the Oral Torah have been consigned to writing. And so that includes the Mishnah, the Tosefta, all the collections of Midrashim, the Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud, are all books. They're ultimately printed, but book consigned to writing. And so the written Torah and the Oral Torah now they're all books now. They're all they're all on our bookshelf. But one it was oral for a very long time. So that's important because I think it can be confusing to people. What's the written Torah? What's the Oral Torah? People get confused because they're all we access them all as like words on paper, but the Oral Torah, as was preserved in oral form for a very long time. Questions, comments about this? Okay. I think next class we will go through. We'll begin the process. It may take the next 2 classes. We'll go through the Jewish library and sort of talk about some of the history of how, the books, the texts that help us know how to live our lives and know how to observe mitzvot. So the history of the development of those books. Okay, like a little tour of the Jewish library. When we used to have this class in person, we would go around. I would actually do it in person. We would look at the books in the Beit Midrash. It was really nice. I feel like for now it's still more it's a little easier for us to gather online. Probably easier for most. So we'll try to figure out some other way to recreate that experience. I'll hold up books or something like that, or I'll take my computer around the Beit Midrash and give you a tour that way. So next class is next Monday. Next Monday the class is going to start at 8 and finish at 8:30. I apologize for that change of time. There was a board meeting that had to be scheduled, and so I apologize. The class got pushed back half an hour, but in general, we'll try to meet as often as we can, as up to 2 or 3 Mondays. Basically, I have shul board meetings 2 Mondays a month, and so the other Mondays I hope to have this class. Okay, unless there's some other reason why I'm out of town or unavailable or something, a holiday or something. But so we'll try to meet as frequently as we can. And all of you are invited to contact the synagogue office to meet with me in person. If you're interested in converting to Judaism, we should definitely be meeting every 3 to 6 weeks. And if no matter what you're interested in, if you have any questions or that you'd like to follow up with me in person, please feel welcome to contact the synagogue office and do so. Okay. I'm going to stop recording now.